In this video, we're going to talk about how to ace the behavioral interview. In a behavioral interview, the question is typically along the lines of, tell me about a time, fill in the blank. And the fill in the blank will likely be one of 5 themes, either leadership, accomplishment, conflict, teamwork, or problem solving. The framework to use to answer this question will be a slightly modified version of the STAR framework, which is situation, task, action, and results. And what we're going to do is combine the S and the T into context. When you're talking about context, there are 3 core things you want to answer. Number 1, tell me the value at stake. It needs to be something of importance. Number 2, tell me the obstacle in place that is preventing you from achieving that value. And number 3, give me a little bit of information so that I understand what this story is about. Those are the 3 elements. Let's now talk about an example. Let's say the question is, tell me about a time you demonstrated leadership on a project. You might infuse the 3 elements into the story as follows. You might say, well, I'm going to tell you about a time where I was on a project where we were launching a new product. And this product was going to be responsible for 30% of the company's revenue. So there was a lot riding on this from a commercial perspective. And finally, one of the major obstacles we had was we lost 3 of our engineers before we had to go and develop this product. So with that type of context, you've A, told them this is about an app you are launching in the App Store. B, you've told them this is very meaningful because there's 30% of revenue on the line. And C, you've told them a core obstacle, which is losing some very important talent to accomplishing this objective. So now I have a very rich sense of context of what this is about, why it's important, and what a core challenge was in realizing that accomplishment. Now that we've talked about the context, let's move on to the second part of this answer, which is the actions. And there's 2 things that are very important to do when you're talking about the actions that you took. Number 1, make it about the actions you took, not the broader actions the team took. It's often a critical mistake that candidates make by talking about what the broader team did when the interviewer is really trying to understand, well, what did you do? And the second part of that is making sure that you explain those actions in a very structured fashion. The interviewer wants to understand the different things that you did. And so there's a couple different ways to put structure in place. One thing you could do is you could say, well, the first thing I did was X, the second thing I did was Y, and the third thing I did was Z, and you can number your actions. But for some people, that can feel a little too forced. So another framing device you can use to show where one action ends and the other action starts is by saying, and then the next thing that I did was, and you move on to the other action. So you want to make sure you're combining both what you did and the clarity of the individual actions that they are, where one ends and where the other one begins. Let's do an example. Let's say the question you're answering is one about how you resolved or managed conflict on a team. And you've already provided the context from step 1, and now you're on the actions. You might say, well, there were 3 things that I did. Number 1, I sat down with my peer to really deeply understand the source of conflict and understand why my peer's opinion was different than mine. The next thing that I did, number 2, is I actually spent some time gathering more data about the problem at hand and soliciting other people's input and feedback and gathering a set of competing perspectives so that I could bring it to bear to following conversations with my peer. And the third thing that I did was really invest time in getting to know my peer outside of just the workplace. Maybe you could talk about how you sat down in some coffee shops with them and really got to understand them on a deeper level. In this way, you're answering the question about conflict management in a holistic way and articulating a discrete series of actions that you took. Now that we have the context and the actions articulated, the third part of this answer is the results. And often candidates feel they have to quantify the results and they get stuck. While it's great to quantify results where you can, it's more important that you tell a very compelling story about how something changed, how something transformed. You really want the interviewer to understand how something was and how it is now. And you can think about, how did the team change? How did the business change? How did the product change? And if you can tell a story about that, it's going to be even more powerful than just stating a revenue increase or a cost decrease. So let's take an example. Let's go back to the situation where you were resolving conflict with a peer. Now, you can always frame up the results and the impact around the decision that you made together and how that decision helped take the company to the next level of growth. But what will also be very compelling to draw out is how this had an impact on your relationship with the peer. How did this impact the broader team? How did this impact the culture of the organization and how other people resolved conflict? You really want to broaden the aperture of results and not make it just narrowly about driving a financial result or a quantifiable outcome, but more about how something evolved from an existing state to a future state that feels fundamentally better and much improved. Now that we've spent some time talking about how to answer any behavioral interview question, I want to make sure I leave you with 3 guiding principles to consider. Number 1, apply a so what lens to your story. Are the elements of the story that you're sharing, the context, the actions, the results, are they pushing the narrative further? If an interviewer were to say, so what, is the answer very clear? Number 2, make sure that you take out any jargon that is very specific to your job or your industry. Often what happens is you're so used to this story that you might forget that the interviewer doesn't really know it as deeply as you do and may not understand the acronyms or the language that are unique to your story. So try to use more basic terminology so that they can connect with the story. And number 3, be very impact-oriented in what you share. Everything should be leading towards impact because ultimately they're looking to make a hiring decision based on the impact you're going to drive for their organization. These are some of the best practices to consider when framing up your story. And what we do at Rocket Interview is sit down with you and figure out what are the most salient aspects of your candidacy, the best stories you've had in your professional career, and then we weave them together to form a compelling career narrative that elevates you above the competition, allows you to ace the interview, and secure your dream job.